Christmas is supposed to be a time of joy, family, and celebration. But for Gary, it became a nightmare etched into eternity. This isn't just a story of festive cheer gone wrong, it's a tale of horror, an encounter with something no one was meant to see. Gary's story starts on a snowy Christmas Eve as he drives alone through an unfamiliar town. But what he found there, or perhaps who found him, would haunt him forever. Before we dive into this chilling tale, make sure you subscribe to Eerie Short and Scary Stories for more terrifying content. Hit the bell icon so you never miss a scare. Gary adjusted his rearview mirror, catching a fleeting glimpse of his tired eyes. The snowy road stretched endlessly before him, a cold white void that seemed to consume everything in its path. The hum of the car engine was his only company, broken intermittently by the static-filled Christmas music crackling through the radio. Each note, meant to inspire cheer, felt hollow, almost mocking the isolation that hung heavy in the air. The snowflakes grew larger, swirling hypnotically against his windshield, making the world outside seem more and more unreal. The temperature inside the car was warm, but Gary couldn't shake the creeping chill that settled deep within his bones. His fingers gripped the steering wheel tighter as the headlights pierced through the darkness, illuminating nothing but the falling snow and the endless stretch of road. There was no sign of another vehicle, no distant glow of a town ahead, just the oppressive silence of winter and the faint groan of his tires against the icy pavement. Then, just as he began to wonder if he'd taken a wrong turn, a dim light flickered in the distance. It grew brighter as he approached, revealing a small, worn-out gas station on the side of the road. The fluorescent sign above it buzzed faintly, the letters spelling out a name too faded to read. It flickered erratically, casting long, distorted shadows over the snow-covered lot. Gary squinted, his unease growing as he slowed the car to a crawl. The town surrounding the station seemed dead, or perhaps forgotten. Rows of houses stood in darkness, their windows like empty eyes staring into the night. No movement, no sound, no signs of life. Even the snow seemed to fall more quietly here, muting the world to an unnatural stillness. The gas station's light was the only thing that broke the monotony, a faint beacon in a place that shouldn't exist. Gary hesitated, his instincts urging him to keep driving, but the glowing empty light on his dashboard left him no choice. With a deep breath, he pulled into the lot, the crunch of his tires breaking the fragile silence. The door creaked loudly as Gary stepped into the diner, the sound breaking the heavy silence that hung in the air. The warm light inside did little to dispel the chill he felt creeping down his spine. A group of patrons sat at the counter and scattered booths, their bodies stiff, their heads bowed over plates of untouched food. No one turned to look at him. Their faces were pale, almost waxy, their expressions blank as if they were there in body but not in spirit. The clinking of a lone spoon against a porcelain cup was the only sound in the room, rhythmic and unnerving. Gary hesitated for a moment, the weight of the atmosphere pressing against him like an invisible force. Something felt wrong. It wasn't just the patrons' eerie stillness. It was the air itself, thick and oppressive, as though the room was holding its breath. The waitress, a thin woman with lifeless eyes, appeared behind the counter. She didn't smile or greet him, only stared at him for a beat too long before motioning toward a booth in the corner. He sat down, his jacket brushing against the sticky surface of the seat. From his spot, he could see everything: the silent diners, the flickering fluorescent light above the counter, and the long hallway leading to the back. The air smelled faintly of grease, but there was something else beneath it, something metallic and sharp. It made his stomach churn. The waitress approached his table, notepad in hand, her voice flat as she asked, "Coffee?" Gary nodded, unable to bring himself to speak. She turned without waiting for a response, disappearing into the kitchen. He rubbed his hands together, trying to shake off the lingering chill, but his unease only deepened. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw movement. A man shuffled toward his booth, his tattered coat dragging along the floor. His hair was wild, sticking out in every direction, and his beard was thick with streaks of gray. His eyes, however, were sharp and bright, almost too bright, as if they didn't belong to his weathered face. Without a word, the man slid into the seat across from Gary, the smell of earth and mildew clinging to him like a second skin. Gary opened his mouth to protest, but the man raised a hand, silencing him. "You're not from here," the man said, his voice calm yet laced with something unsettling. He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Gary's. "You've never seen anything like it before. The Christ child. He's here." The words hung in the air, heavy and cold. Gary blinked, unsure if he'd heard him correctly. "What?" he finally managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. The man's lips curled into a faint smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "The child. A miracle," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "You won't understand until you see him." Gary felt his pulse quicken. The rational part of him screamed to get up, to leave the diner and never look back, but something in the man's gaze held him in place. It wasn't just curiosity, it was something deeper, a pull he couldn't explain. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the edge of the table. "Where?" he asked, his voice trembling despite himself. The man's grin widened, and he motioned toward the door with a nod. "I'll show you," he said, standing slowly. Without waiting for a response, he turned and began walking toward the exit. Gary sat frozen for a moment, his mind racing. Every instinct told him not to follow, but his legs moved on their own as he pushed himself out of the booth and trailed after the man, his heart pounding in his chest. Gary stepped out into the biting cold, his breath forming clouds in the air as he followed the old man. The snow seemed heavier now, falling in thick, relentless sheets that muffled every sound. The world around him felt unnaturally still, as if the town itself was holding its breath. The man didn't speak, his boots crunching against the snow with a steady rhythm. Gary's unease deepened with every step, but an inexplicable force compelled him to keep going. The old man led him past the gas station, through a narrow side street, and into an alleyway that seemed to stretch endlessly. The darkness here was different, deeper, more suffocating. The glow from the nearby streetlights barely penetrated the narrow passage, their light swallowed by the shadows that clung to the brick walls. Gary glanced back over his shoulder, but the entrance to the alley had vanished into the swirling snow. His pulse quickened as he realized how far they'd gone. Each step seemed to take him deeper into something he couldn't name. The air grew colder, heavier, as though it carried a weight that pressed against his chest. The old man moved with purpose, his figure barely visible now against the white blur of the storm. Gary hesitated for a moment, his instincts screaming at him to stop, but the old man turned his head slightly, his voice carrying through the oppressive silence. "Not much farther now," the man said, his tone calm, almost soothing. Gary swallowed hard and pressed on, his boots slipping slightly on the icy ground. The snow began to feel thicker beneath his feet, like it wanted to pull him down with each step. Then they stopped. A faint light flickered ahead, a single bulb hanging from a rusty fixture above a doorway. The dim glow illuminated a small clearing within the alley, and at the center of it, on a tattered blanket, sat a child. Gary froze, his breath catching in his throat. The child couldn't have been more than 3 or 4 years old, his tiny frame dwarfed by the heavy shadows around him. His skin was pale, almost luminous in the weak light, and his hair fell in dark, messy curls. But it was his eyes that held Gary captive. They were a vivid emerald green, unnatural in their brightness, as if they were lit from within. The glow of those eyes pierced through the gloom, locking onto Gary's with an intensity that made his knees feel weak. For a moment, everything else faded away. The cold, the snow, the alley, they all ceased to exist. Gary felt a strange warmth bloom in his chest, spreading through his body like a gentle wave. It wasn't just physical warmth, it was something deeper, a sense of peace that he hadn't felt in years. Every worry, every burden he'd carried seemed to melt away under the child's gaze. He couldn't look away, and he didn't want to. It was as if the child's very presence was soothing his soul, erasing the weight of the world. The old man stood silently to the side, his face unreadable as he watched Gary. "Do you see now?" he asked softly, his voice breaking the spell. Gary blinked, shaking his head slightly as if trying to clear his thoughts. He took a hesitant step forward, drawn to the child like a moth to a flame. The child tilted his head, a small, almost innocent smile spreading across his lips. Gary felt his chest tighten, a single thought repeating in his mind: this can't be real. But even as doubt crept in, the warmth in his chest grew stronger, pulling him closer. He knelt down, his hands trembling as he reached out toward the child, his instincts overridden by an inexplicable compulsion. The snow swirled around them, the flickering light casting strange, dancing shadows on the walls. Gary's voice came out in a whisper, barely audible. Who are you?" The child didn't answer. He simply stared, his emerald eyes glowing brighter, drawing Gary further into their depths. Gary knelt down, his breath shallow, his hand trembling as it hovered near the child's tiny frame. The warmth that had filled his chest moments ago began to shift, subtly at first, then more profoundly, turning into something far darker. The child tilted his head, his smile widening ever so slightly, but there was nothing innocent about it now. It was a smile that didn't belong to a child, one that carried a sinister intent. Gary froze, his instincts roaring back to life, screaming at him to pull away, but he was rooted to the spot, unable to break the hold of those eyes. Then, as he watched, the vibrant emerald hue in the child's eyes began to drain away. The green was replaced by black, pure, unrelenting darkness that seemed to stretch endlessly, like staring into the void of night itself. The light above flickered violently, casting erratic shadows that danced across the alley walls, and the air grew colder, sharper, almost suffocating. The child's grin stretched impossibly wide, its delicate features twisting into something grotesque. The small, rounded teeth in its mouth elongated, growing sharper, glinting faintly in the dim light. Gary's breath hitched, his body finally responding as he tried to pull back, but it was too late. With a speed that defied logic, the child lunged forward, its small hands, now claw-like and unnaturally strong, clamping down on Gary's wrist. The grip was icy, almost burning in its intensity, and Gary gasped in pain as the child's nails dug into his skin. Before he could react further, the child's mouth opened wider than should have been possible, and those jagged needle-like teeth sank into his neck. The pain was immediate and excruciating. It radiated through his body, a searing agony that felt as though it were ripping him apart from the inside. Gary screamed, the sound raw and desperate, but the alley seemed to swallow it whole. The snow fell silently around them, muffling the world outside, leaving only the grotesque scene to play out in terrible quiet. His vision blurred as his blood drained, his strength fading with every second. The warmth he had felt before was now a cruel mockery, replaced by a cold emptiness that spread through his veins. The child's laughter began to echo in his ears, high-pitched, shrill, and inhuman. It wasn't the laughter of a child, but something far older, far more malevolent, a sound that carried centuries of malice. Gary's body sagged, his knees hitting the frozen ground as the child released him. He clutched at his neck, blood seeping between his fingers as his mind struggled to comprehend what had just happened. The child stepped back, its grin still fixed in place, its black eyes glinting with satisfaction. Gary's vision dimmed, the world around him fading into shadows, and the last thing he saw was the old man watching from the corner, his face unreadable. Then, everything went dark. Gary's eyes fluttered open, his head pounding as though his skull was splitting in two. For a moment, everything was a blur. The world around him was dim and distorted, like he was looking through a fogged window. Slowly, the shapes began to sharpen, and he realized he was back in the diner. He was seated in the same booth, the sticky seat pressing against his back, the same oppressive silence hanging in the air. The soft hum of fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, grounding him in this unsettling reality. The waitress appeared, her movements robotic and void of emotion. She slid a plate of food onto the table in front of him without a word or glance, then turned and walked away, vanishing into the shadowed kitchen. Gary's heart raced as he stared at the untouched plate. It was exactly what he had ordered before: eggs, toast, and a side of bacon, but it looked off. The food was greasy, unnaturally shiny, as if coated in something more than oil. The faint metallic smell he had noticed earlier lingered, stronger now, invading his nostrils. Gary's hands trembled as he reached out, his fingers hovering just above the plate. The dim light above flickered, and his breath hitched. Something in the greasy surface of the eggs caught his eye, a distorted reflection. Slowly, his gaze fixed on it, his chest tightening as he leaned closer. His own face stared back at him, pale and gaunt, but his eyes, they weren't his anymore. The once familiar blue had been replaced by a sickly, glowing green, almost identical to the child's piercing gaze. His breath caught in his throat as he leaned back abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. The faint glow of his eyes reflected back at him from every surface: the windows, the silverware, even the salt shaker. Gary's pulse quickened as he scanned the diner, searching for some explanation, some way out. But the patrons at the counter remained as they were, their heads still bowed, their faces lifeless. The old man was nowhere to be seen. The oppressive silence seemed to grow heavier, suffocating him, pressing down on his chest like a weight he couldn't lift. Then, like a whisper carried on the wind, a voice echoed in his mind. It wasn't his own, and it wasn't coming from anywhere he could see. "You are one of us now. You belong to the child." Gary clutched at the table, his knuckles white, his breathing shallow. The warmth he had once felt in the child's presence was gone, replaced by an unbearable cold that radiated from within. He felt hollow, as though something vital had been taken from him, leaving behind only a shell. The snow continued to fall outside, the faint glow of the gas station sign flickering through the window. The town felt smaller now, more isolated, as though the rest of the world no longer existed. Gary's gaze fell back to the plate in front of him, his reflection staring back at him with those glowing, inhuman eyes. He wasn't the first, and he wouldn't be the last. The realization settled in his mind like a stone sinking into deep water. The town wasn't just a place, it was a trap, a feeding ground for something far older and darker than he could comprehend. And it would wait, patient and silent, for its next victim to stumble in, lured by the promise of warmth and safety. Gary's hands fell limp to his sides as he sat motionless in the booth, his reflection staring back at him from every angle. Somewhere in the shadows, the faint sound of a child's laughter echoed, high-pitched and haunting. The diner remained still, waiting for the next soul to join its ranks. And so, the sinister cycle continues. Gary became just another piece of the town's dark secret, forever bound to its horrifying purpose. The Christ child waits, hidden in the shadows, ready to claim its next victim. It's a chilling reminder that some places aren't meant to be found, and some miracles aren't what they seem. If this story left you with a chill down your spine, let us know your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done in Gary's place? Could you have resisted the pull of the Christ child, or would you have fallen victim too? Thank you for watching Eerie Short and Scary Stories. Don't forget to hit that like button if you enjoyed this tale. It helps us bring more terrifying content to fans like you. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a scare. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and beware of the unknown.